the way intuition as sensibility shapes that which is given to us and allows us to receive it. Right? So representation is not a concept or an idea in this sense. Right? What grounds the perception of succession is a form of sensible intuition. Continuing from our discussion, right, from space in all the same ways. It is that which packages what we receive so that we're able to perceive it. That this intuition of time represents our sensibility, what we take in through our sensibility in such a way. I think this is what Kant means by the representation of time here, that which grounds perception, which makes perception possible. So this representation gives us beings in time according to the form of succession. Now, the representation of time, the way time represents what is intuited and what is given to us through sensibility, is the most essential form of representation because it lets all other representations be possible. So time is represented for us beforehand as a representation, a presentation of these things that we are given, that allows all of these representations, presentations of the world to be possible. So it's a condition for the possibility of experience, a representation that is part of the form of subjectivity. He goes on, time is a necessary representation that grounds all intuitions. Right? So this idea of a ground is again the idea of the condition for the possibility and more. In it alone is all actuality of appearances possible. The latter, appearances, could all disappear, but time itself, as the universal condition of their possibility, cannot be removed. Right? So just as we saw with space, it is possible to imagine space independently of any object existing within that space. And this is true of time also, right? We can imagine time passing independently of any object, Kant thinks. We cannot imagine experience without time. Right? There has never been a moment of your existence that has not been represented through time. And so for Kant, this is evidence that it is a form of subjective experience and not part of experience itself, not outside ourselves. And this is where he says, again, this is on 179, it has only one dimension. Different times are not simultaneous but successive, just as different spaces are not successive but simultaneous. So time is, again, only succession. We can ignore this problem of time as simultaneity. That is only a problem when we're thinking about the first cause, in which cause and effect must be simultaneous. Kant thinks time is successive, space is simultaneous. There are no simultaneous times. T1 cannot be simultaneous with T2. There is no way around succession. However, he says, different times are only parts of one and the same time. Right? So just as we saw with space, although we can divide space infinitely, that infinite divisibility doesn't take away from and is made possible by the fact that there is also only and always only one space. So space is infinite and singular. Now, the same is ultimately true of time. Time is infinite and singular. It can be divided into, it can always be divided. Right? There is no smallest unit of time empirically. Right? There is no experience of a unit of time other than one that we as humans have invented. The second is an arbitrary magnitude of time, as Kant will say. And regardless of how we divide time, that we divide time, time nevertheless remains singular, a one part of a singular succession, right? So successive yet one, divided but one. This, just like space, is a sign of it being a form of intuition. Universal meaning in each case singularly and as a totality, right? That which is attached to each singular individual and exists in the absence of any individual external body must be a form of our subjectivity, part of our intuition. So our experience of time, Kant thinks, is not conceptual. It's certainly not grounded in an empirical concept. We have no empirical experience of a unit of time. And he says the concept of time does not demand non-simultaneity or succession, right? But our experience does. In other words, time is not a concept. It doesn't sort of fit into the limits of a concept. And that's what Hume ultimately butts up against when he is thinking about the beginning of time and the first cause, and the fact that the beginning of time and the beginning of a chain of causes requires that time be both successive and simultaneous, and that there's contradiction in that, right? So the concept of time implies a kind of contradiction, and therefore time is more than or less than something other than a concept. The infinitude of time signifies nothing more, Kant writes, than that every determinate magnitude of time is only possible through limitations of a single time grounding it. The original representation, time, must therefore be given as unlimited. So the fact that time can be broken into magnitudes is only possible because it's given without limit. Right? We can do as we please with time, break it into whatever kind of magnitude we choose, because it is not something that imposes itself on us, but which we impose on the world and can, as it were, wield as a power of our own. It does not divide itself as all other appearances do. Right? As empirical bodies are discretely divided, time has no object, no necessary division. Therefore, Kant thinks it is an intuition. Now, what about the essential concepts that are attached to our idea of time? And in particular, thinking about the concepts of motion, change, and this concept of linearity, that time is like a line, or time is like an arrow. Right? Do these not impose themselves on us? Do these not show, in some sense, that time is something outside of ourselves, not an intuition, but something that exists independently of us, which we do in fact experience and get some empirical concept of through experience, right? Don't we get a sense of time through motion, through change, perhaps? Kant says on 179, the concept of motion as alteration of place, change, is only possible through and in the representation of time. That if this representation were not a priori inner intuition, then no concept, whatever it might be, could make comprehensible the possibility of alteration. So what Kant is saying is that in order for us to experience change, in order for us to experience alteration, and thus in order for us to experience motion, we have to, a priori, beforehand, have an intuition representation of time. Now, why? Because change implies something remaining the same and yet at the same time undergoing changes over a period of time, right? So if we did not have a concept of time as succession, we wouldn't experience the idea of change. We would experience only difference, right? So I'm trying to think of something that changes quickly, right? Let's say a shadow falls over you. The sun goes behind a tree, right? And a shadow falls over you. Now we experience that as change, right? What was illuminated goes into shadow. That alteration is only understood and can only be understood, is only understandable as change and